29 years into our democracy and inequality remains a ticking time bomb. And the World Bank has recently declared South Africa yet again a country which has the highest inequality status in the world. Why are governments failing, or why is this government failing to deal with poverty as well as inequality? That's the question that we're asking you this evening. Also joined this evening by Professor Julian May, who's the Director for the Center of Excellence in Food Security at the University of the Western Cape. And she has been recently appointed to the National Planning Commission. And also joining us this evening is Moeletsi Mbeki, who is an economist, and also joining us this evening to have this conversation. But remember that you can also be part of the conversation by going on to our social media platforms, including Twitter. Please use the handle @Unfiltered SABC, that is @Unfiltered SABC, and on Facebook, just search for Unfiltered SABC. But first of all, let's take a listen to what the President had to say last week on Human Rights Day about this issue of inequality.
Are still a long way from being a nation of equals. In recent weeks, a number of studies have told us that inequality in South Africa is growing and is deepening. This situation has been made worse by the global pandemic that has now entered its third year. The pandemic has had a grave impact on the ability of people to lead the lives of dignity promised by our Constitution. The study of the World Bank notes that South Africa remains the most unequal country in the world, and that race continues to be a key driver of inequality.
And let's start off the conversation. Professor May, let's start off with you. What would you say the characteristics of South Africa's inequality are?
Thank you for that question. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be seeing Mr. Mbeki again. It's probably been 2 decades since we last interacted. What causes poverty to persist? I really think we underestimate the deep scars that have been left behind on our society by the period of colonialism and apartheid. So some of that is due to the structural forces that were set in motion in that period. Subsequently, we had the misfortune of rejoining the global economy at a time when most economic policies were in fact favoring inequality. And so many of the policies that we chose to adopt in the 1990s were ones which did not directly address the problem of inequality. In some ways, we've excused it. We've permitted inequality to persist because of how we structured our society at that time. So I think there's a range of forces, and the one thing where perhaps I might differ from the comments that you had to introduce this thing is it's not simply a matter of whether government has failed. Mm-hmm. It's how the whole of society has failed to address the question of inequality.
But who comes up with those policies? And who's supposed to implement those policies?
In South Africa, policies are not simply something which a government imposes. They are negotiated. They're both negotiated in public through consultative fora. They're also undertaken where significant lobbying takes place. So many policies are written not only with direct contributions from society, but also indirect advice, guidance from those that might in fact benefit from some measure of inequality. So as I say, I think we are all accountable, not simply government.
So, but where does the buck then stop? Because while you would be soliciting contributions from members of society and the different organizations and so forth, however, though, who does the buck stop with? Who takes responsibility ultimately for policies that are implemented?
Ultimately, it would be the current administration. but also each period when we get a chance to vote, it's society, because we vote, we choose who's going to represent us.
Yeah. Yeah, Mr. Mbeki, thank you so much for making time for us as well. Let's take a listen to what your take is on some of those forces that keep inequality entrenched in South Africa. And of course, as we said during that intro as well, with the World Bank again saying that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. Mr. Mbeki, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Well, I think, you know, one of the mistakes that many of us makes, especially us, the political analysts, is to think the ANC set out to address inequality in South Africa. The ANC did not set out to address inequality. It set out to be incorporated into the system of inequality that already existed under the British colonial rule. Remember, the founders of the ANC, many of them were voters under the Cape Liberal Constitution of 1853. So they were quite familiar with the inequality of South Africa, and they wanted to be more incorporated into that system rather than to change the system. And this message was actually articulated by Nelson Mandela himself in the 1950s. When he was asked about the Freedom Charter, he was asked, is the nationalization clause of the Freedom Charter intended to introduce socialism in South Africa? And Mandela was very explicit in an article he wrote in a magazine called Liberation. He said the purpose of the Freedom Charter is to open up the capitalist system so that African capitalists can become capitalists in their own rights. He didn't say it is to create equality. He said is to open the opportunities for African capitalists. He never mentioned anything about African workers, about colored workers or Indian workers or rural poor or whatever. So there's a very big mistake that we make in South Africa, is to believe the propaganda that the ANC politicians give us, which is that they set up to radically change the society, the capitalist society of South Africa. They never did such a thing. They set out to have the black middle class to be incorporated into the colonial system. And so when they eventually got into power and got incorporated, they didn't change anything. In fact, they make themselves richer, which is what the World Bank is pointing out, is that inequality has grown in South Africa since 1994, rather than become reduced. So, which proves my point that the ANC never set up to remove inequality. It set up to have the middle class, the black middle class, to be incorporated into the unequal system that they found in existence, that was established essentially in the last quarter of the 19th century by the British colonial government.
Okay, let's just quickly read some of the tweets that you sent through, and when we come back, we'll then focus on what specific policies that have been introduced as interventions. Some, for instance, would argue around the point of speaking about, some would argue about the point of speaking about the BEE as a policy introduction to try and deal with transformation. Let's look at some of these tweets. This one from Cindy C, saying that we need to take full responsibility for our misfortunes. Mnandi Tinga Okuba City. Sabelo saying that no other party has been in power since 29 years back. 80% of the current ANC serving ministers have been serving there for the last 15 years and beyond, as well as in different structures of government. And this one, Prince Shabazz saying that my ANC government for not enforcing Immigration Act and the porous borders, EFF for encouraging illegal immigrants into SA. Both these factors add to growing inequality and poverty because South Africans are forced to share little to no resources with immigrants. So continue to give us some of your perspectives that you have on this particular question in relation to inequality in South Africa, and we will read some of those tweets when we come back. And welcome back as we focus on this very difficult question in relation to the inequality in South Africa. And as I've indicated, we're joined by Professor Julian May, who's the Director for the Center of Excellence in Food Security at the University of the Western Cape. And we're also joined by the political analyst or economic analyst, that is Moeletsi Mbeki. Professor May, let's go back to the report that was issued by the NPC. This one is from last year. The findings which were contained in the National Planning Commission's report on the country's economic progress towards the National Development Plan, Vision 2030. And the report states here that if you look at 90 to 95% of wealth being concentrated in the top decile as compared to the global average of 55 to 60%. Why is it that we have this particular inequality and the figures running so high, considering at the same time we are told that we have progressive tax and we also have systems in place to ensure that we deal with inequality?
Yeah, we do indeed have progressive tax, but it's a progressive tax largely that falls on income rather than wealth.
Yeah.
And so if you are an income earner, and ultimately that's the middle class, then the middle class are going to be experiencing the tax rates. And that's, in a sense, one of the things that drives our measure, such as the Gini index, which is used to measure inequality. So if your middle class are paying very high taxes, also paying high property taxes, and have other burdens that they pay, then you have what is often referred to as the hollowing out of the middle class. Mm-hmm. Statistically, that widens the Gini coefficient. So when that takes place, your Gini coefficient changes quite dramatically, irrespective of what happens to the most wealthy or the most poor. At the top end, we have probably even higher levels of inequality in terms of wealth ownership. So that's ownership of stocks and shares, that's money invested in pension plans, that's money invested in land. Until we start thinking about wealth taxes, and particularly wealth taxes across generations, so taxes on capital gains when there are deaths, a range of other taxes which could also start to focus on wealth, we're not really going to get to the grips of the structure of our inequality system. Inequality isn't simply a disease. It's a structural force. It's based on the assets that people have, the knowledge that they have to be able to turn those assets into further wealth, and the ability to turn that income again back into wealth. So ultimately, that's the driver. We need to think of ways in which we can break that or interrupt that transfer of all that wealth from generation to generation.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Mbeki, is wealth tax the right idea or intervention to deal with inequality? Well,
judging by what happens to our taxes under the present government, you can tax as much as you like, but if the money is going to be stolen by the politicians and by the civil servants, then it makes absolutely no difference, the tax. So it depends on how the country is governed and what the intentions of the ruling elites are. The South African government, as has been reported repeatedly by the Auditor General and by others is riddled with corruption. So whether you tax the wealthy or you tax the poor, that money ends up in the hands of the political elite who embezzle it in one form or another. So the question of a wealth tax is a very abstract notion in the context of South Africa. State resources in South Africa are used for the benefit of the elite, irrespective of where they come from. I mean, remember, the poor are taxpayers as well. They pay, or the poor and the working class, they pay, for example, VAT. Now that VAT ends up in the hands of the ruling elite, parts of which are embezzled. So there is no abstract solution to South Africa's problem. There are political solutions. Many people think there are technical solutions to South Africa's problems. South Africa's problems are primarily about the distribution of political power between the various social classes or the various social groups. At the end of the day, that's what it is. The people who control political power today use that political power for their own benefit, whether they get to those resources by taxing the rich or by taxing the poor. They don't care. They pocket the resources that get into the coffers of the state.
Yeah. Professor May, do you agree with that?
I wish I didn't. It's a depressing scenario because I am ultimately a technical person. I would like to find ways in which we could adjust the system, we could adjust the taxation policies, we could make better use of the resources. Whenever we talk about the money stolen from the taxpayer, I think it's actually the money that's stolen from the people who should have been given the grants, who should have been given the services, who should have been given the facilities. So it's not about stealing our tax money, it's about stealing our grant money. Do I agree with it? The evidence is looking quite bleak, frankly. I hope that we can rebuild that South African story, which I think, mostly believed in it back in the 1990s, and try and think about ways in which we can hold those that we have voted into power politically accountable. At the moment, it's hard for me to disagree with Mr. Mbeki as much as I would like to.
Yeah, and Mr. Mbeki, that holding the political elite accountable, would that come from changing the electoral system that we currently have?
Well, that's one of the ways. Remember, the electoral system we have makes the members of parliament dependent on the whims of the top six, for example, in the case of the ANC, or the top leadership in the case of the DA and the other parties. Our members of parliament are not independent. So we need a big portion of our members of parliament to become independent so that they then to be elected directly from constituencies, so that they are able to hold the executive into account. Under our current electoral system, the members of parliament are not, especially those belonging to the ruling party, are not able to hold the executive to account. So yes, that is one of the things that has to be done. It's not the only one. We need more stronger political parties in South Africa. I noticed, for example, that the opposition parties, realizing that they are made up of fragmented, weak parties, are now trying to put together a new alliance amongst themselves so that they face the ANC down in 2024 as a united front. Now, that is a positive development. These fragmented little parties that we have in South Africa are not strengthening democracy, despite what many people may think. They are actually weakening democracy. You need 2 or 3 strong parties that are capable of replacing each other. I mean, look at the difference. Let's take the example of the United States. Look at the difference it made to how COVID-19 was handled once Trump was voted out as president and replaced with Joe Biden. Suddenly, the people of the United States, their morale went up and their health care were improved because the new administration had a different attitude towards COVID-19 and went out on a blitz to vaccinate the whole population and so on. So the question of having big competitive parties is for real. That's what we need in South Africa.
Okay, and when we come back, the conversation that we're going to have is looking at this inequality, as the World Bank says, is also characterized and determined by factors such as race, parental education, and occupation of fathers. And welcome back, Mr. Mbeki. Let's start off with you with the closing remarks, but also factoring this in where the World Bank's report says the inequality of opportunity is likewise and is determined by factors such as race, for instance. And I know that you're not a big fan of BEE. So what sort of transformative policies should then be put in place to make sure that we also deal with this aspect where inequality also has a racial face to it? Okay, let's go to Professor May in the meantime. Professor May, how would you answer that question in relation to how we deal with inequality which has a race to it? Okay, we seem to have lost our guest there, unfortunately. Okay, with that, we've come to the end of the show. Thank you so much to Professor Julian May, as well as Moeletsi Mbeki for being part of the conversation today. And thank you so much for your contribution as well. It's been a great night. Totsiens. See you again next week, same time, same place, right here on S3.